It's Friday, November 22nd, 2024. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Granthermes. Today on the show, Trump's pick to be Attorney General, former Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz, backs out after some real bad meetings with U.S. senators and some really bad news stories that broke about federal investigators being pretty confident that Gaetz paid women for sex. At least one, if not multiples of those women were underage. Trump then nominated a new Attorney General pick who also has scandals in her past, and I take a quick look at what we can expect from a Trump Department of Justice in 2025. Plus, I talk to political scientist Jonathan Bernstein from the Good Politics, Bad Politics podcast and Substack, as well as other places out there. But first, let's get to your headlines. On Tuesday this week, Ukraine said it launched U.S.-made long-range missiles into Russia, the first time it's done that since the U.S. gave it the okay to do so. Now, the missiles were launched at an ammunitions depot and mark a new stage in the war that's now gone on longer than 1,000 days. The missile launch came just a day before President Joe Biden reversed his own policy and approved sending Ukraine anti-personnel mines, even though their use was banned by an international treaty in 1997, and Ukraine signed that agreement in 1999. However, the U.S. never signed that agreement, despite everyone from the Red Cross to Human Rights Watch and the UN all saying that mines should be banned. On Wednesday, the U.S. Department of Justice and a handful of states asked a federal judge to force Google to sell off Chrome, its web browser, a move that could reshape the $2 trillion company and fundamentally alter the internet. Now, that comes just a few months after a federal judge also found that Google had been illegally running a monopoly on search engines by making Google the default search engine on a range of devices and across companies with sort of back deal and back channel agreements. That's why when you open your iPhone, it goes right to Google when you search. Now, the judge in that case, which is the same judge in this entire case, gave Google an option. Sell off Android, the phone and app company, or whatever the DOJ in these states came up with, which was selling Chrome. Google has until December 20th to decide what it's going to do. And finally, on Thursday, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, his defense minister, and the military chief for Hamas over the war in Gaza. Now, the warrants haven't been made public yet, but the court said that they do include accusations of using starvation as a weapon of war and intentionally attacking civilians. The warrants are a major blow to Israel's standing on the world stage and follow a request that was made by international prosecutors back in May. Netanyahu's office called the warrants absurd and false. Okay, that is it for your headlines. Let's get to our main story. Trump does the AG shuffle, and we talk about his Department of Justice. It has been another whirlwind week for the Trump administration, and this week also kicks off a new series I'll be doing between now and Inauguration Day, looking at almost sort of all the departments and what we can expect from the people that Trump has nominated who are likely going to get confirmed, although we'll talk about that in a second, and just what we can expect in a new Trump administration for these departments. And this week, we're always going to start with Department of Justice because I think that for Trump, really, it's maybe his most important department, at least to him personally. But then with the news that happened this week, there was just no other place to start. So last week on the show and on the Substack, I talked about former Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz getting nominated to be Trump's Attorney General. And hang on with me here because the run-up to what happened this week is a lot, but I want to get you guys up to speed first. And also, word of warning, because we're talking about Matt Gaetz here, this is not going to be a kid-friendly episode. Gaetz is not liked by his Republican colleagues in the House nor in the Senate because he had caused an internal coup that ousted a mostly popular Speaker of the House in Kevin McCarthy, which sent the party into an embarrassing tailspin that set a record for the longest stretch where the House and thus Congress didn't have a leader. Eventually, that got us to U.S. House Speaker Mike Johnson. We'll talk about him some more in a minute and why that's important. The other reason that people don't like Gaetz is He's gross. A number of members of the House and the Senate, publicly and privately, have said that Gaetz was known to show homemade porn or talk about drug-fueled orgies in the halls of the U.S. Capitol building and even on the House floor. And then there are the allegations that Gaetz, on at least several occasions, paid to have sex with women, bringing them across state lines, which is sex trafficking, and at least one, if not more than that, were underage. Those allegations launched a federal investigation and a House ethics investigation into Gaetz. Now, after months of investigating, the DOJ, the Department of Justice, opted not to press charges against Gaetz, despite his longtime friend and alleged co-conspirator in the trafficking confessing to it and naming Gaetz as an accomplice. The House ethics probe is different, and that gets us to this week. So the House Ethics Committee, which in theory does exactly what it sounds like, it's supposed to police the ethics of the members of the House, and we can debate on how good of a job that committee is doing at a different day, but they had been investigating for months and had officially come up with a report that was supposed to be released last week. Now, the report allegedly had some really damning stuff in it about Gaetz, including women who came forward and spoke to the committee telling them that Gaetz paid them for sex, including one of them when she was 17, which was then followed by an exclusive report from CNN yesterday that it was actually two 17-year-olds. And before that story broke, CNN asked Gaetz and his team for a comment. They gave him ample time to respond before they released the story. They told him exactly when they were going to be releasing the story, which was at 12:30 in the afternoon. He never answered and instead withdrew his nomination 45 minutes after that story broke. Now, the report that the House Ethics Committee finished, like I said, was supposed to be released last week, but Matt Gaetz resigned from the House almost right away after he was nominated to be the Attorney General, likely hoping that it would prevent the report from being released. But there was still talk about it getting out there, and that is when Speaker Mike Johnson stepped in and did this.
I do not believe that that is an appropriate thing. It doesn't follow our rules and traditions, and there is a reason for that. It would open a Pandora's box. I don't think that's a healthy thing for the institution.
So that is actually striking to hear from Johnson, only because he had just said a few days beforehand that it wasn't his place as Speaker of the House to tell the Ethics Committee what to do with the report. But I do think it's meaningful that he switched sides here, partly because it's a fealty to Trump, right? Because Trump wanted Matt Gaetz to be AG. This report would make that more difficult, and Johnson is doing what Trump wants. But also, Johnson owes his extremely powerful position. The Speaker of the House is number 3 in the line of succession. It goes President, Vice President, Speaker of the House. And he owes that job in large part to Gaetz, who kicked off the entire saga of House Republicans and all of Congress not having a leader last year. It's that little coup that I talked about. Johnson has largely been beholden, that means, to this small group of pro-Trump, burn-it-down zealots like Gaetz, Marjorie Taylor Greene from Georgia, or Jim Jordan from Ohio. And releasing the report would have meant that Johnson was knowingly throwing his lot behind somebody who was accused of doing the things that Matt Gaetz is accused of doing, even though I'd argue by urging that the report stays hidden, he's openly throwing support behind Gaetz, sort of a damned if he does, damned if he doesn't sort of situation. He's backing Gaetz for other reasons. Ultimately, the House Ethics Committee deadlocked in their vote on whether to release the report or not, which means it doesn't get released. And that's caused some pretty obvious anger from Democrats and those who want this out in the open. And those Democrats called it a black mark on Congress and led a call to get the entire Congress to vote on it. Now, that likely won't happen because Johnson is in charge of which votes come to the House floor, which means it'll never see the light of day. But honestly here, I think those Democrats are right. If only for the reason that this report is ours as taxpayers. It's a congressional investigation that was finished. The time and effort done not just by the members of the committee, but also their staff and whoever else they worked with, that's all money that we spent from the taxes that we pay. And I think that we deserve to know what they found regardless of whether Matt Gaetz is still in Congress or not, because the people who knew these things about him, who didn't say anything, and know these things about him now, are still there and are still ostensibly acting on our behalf because we put them there with our votes. Anyway, I'll hop off the soapbox here. While all that was happening, the New York Times released a bombshell report thanks to a leak that they got of the federal investigation into Gaetz that showed investigators had tied a lot of Venmo payments from Gaetz to women and other friends, totaling around $10,000, along with some more payments that were, like I said, payments to friends or associates, and people that Gaetz knew to sort of facilitate what investigators found drug-fueled parties or orgies. The Department of Justice doesn't release things like this publicly when they don't bring charges, but this was prepared information for the House Ethics Committee, so we don't know whether the leak came from the DOJ or from the committee. And as all of that was circulating in the news, Donald Trump and J.D. Vance were doing a full court press on U.S. senators who would end up voting on whether Gaetz would actually get the attorney general job. Trump was working the phones, which was unusual for him because he just doesn't do that. And J.D. Vance went personally with Matt Gaetz into meetings with U.S. senators, and those meetings did not go well. In the end, it was Trump who pulled the plug on Gaetz' nomination, according to sources who talked to the outlet The Bulwark. Trump apparently telling Gaetz, "You don't have the votes, these senators aren't moving." And Gaetz then withdrew his nomination, ending his career, at least for now, in public elected office. And it also means that we don't get a full report about whether he trolled high school parking lots for hookups. Now, in the hours, literally the hours after Gaetz withdrew, there were some other names that were thrown out there, but Trump quickly nominated former Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi. So Trump is keeping it at least close to home. He's from Florida, Gaetz is from Florida, Bondi's from Florida. Bondi has been at least semi-prominent in national Republican circles for about 15 years or so, maybe a little less than that. But she got her start as a prosecutor in Hillsborough County, Florida, which is where Tampa is. She was and remains a frequent and pretty good guest on Fox News before becoming the Florida Attorney General in 2010, now largely on the back of that TV experience. Her time as AG in Florida, though, is riddled with scandals and controversy. She was the lead lawyer on the national lawsuit to end the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, which failed. She also tried to stop the ACA from forcing insurance companies to cover pre-existing conditions in court. That also failed. She opposed same-sex marriage, and then after the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando, she turned and supported the LGBTQ community, which led to this pretty testy exchange between her and Anderson Cooper that went viral.
Nothing to do. I've never said I don't like gay people. That's ridiculous.
But do you worry about using language accusing gay people of trying to do harm to the people of Florida when doesn't that send a message to some people who might have bad ideas in mind?
Anderson, I don't believe gay people could do harm to the state of Florida.
But you argued that in court.
My lawyer argued a case defending what the Supreme Court allowed the voters to put in our state constitution.
But you were arguing that gay marriage, if there was gay marriage, if there was same-sex marriage, that would do harm to the people of Florida, to Florida society.
That it was constitutional to put that in the Constitution.
Are you saying you did not believe it would do harm to Florida?
Of course not. Of course not. Gay people. No, I've never said that. Those words have never come out of my mouth.
But that is specifically what you were arguing in court.
No.
So there's a lot more to that exchange, and I'm sure it'll get played a lot in the run-up to her confirmation hearing, if there is one. But it put Bondi on the map in a real way for Republicans. So much so that she got a speaking slot in 2016 at the Republican National Convention and was all in on Trump. Here's a piece of that speech.
Donald Trump will stop it. Lock her up. I love that. Stay with me.
So it was short and it was at the end there, but that lock her up thing. This is an attorney general. This is somebody who upholds the law. And if there were any questions about her feelings on going after Trump's opponents using the force of law, that should answer it. Now, after that, there were the scandals, which range from the truly bad to the just weird. In 2010, Bondi established a close relationship with the Church of Scientology, taking campaign donations from the organization, which she said she did because they wanted to stop human trafficking, despite Scientology's own history of being sued for human trafficking. In 2011, she pressured 2 attorneys investigating a financial services company to resign before that company that was being investigated then gave her money for her campaign. In 2013, and this is one of the big ones here, Donald Trump donated to her Attorney General re-election campaign while she was deciding whether or not to join a lawsuit against Trump's former for-profit college, Trump University, for fraud. She ultimately did not bring charges after getting that campaign donation that was later deemed to be illegal because it violated certain campaign finance laws. For reasons that are complicated and not worth getting into here, just know that they were found to be illegal. And then it came out later that both Bondi and Trump knew at the time that they were illegal after saying they had no idea. In 2018, Bondi hosted, at least guest hosted, the Fox News show The Five for several days while she was still the Florida Attorney General. And she said at the time that she got permission to do that from the State Ethics Commission. The head of that commission at that point in time said she did not. And then there was the time that she stopped an execution so she could go to a fundraiser and just moved the date of that execution. She did later apologize for it, but still, we're talking about somebody, like I said, who upholds the law and presumably is doing that in an ethical way. All these scandals point to, at the very least, Bondi's sort of playing it fast and loose when it comes to the ideas of the law and ethics. Now, after leaving public office, she worked as a lobbyist for the Middle Eastern country Qatar before coming back into the public eye as a member of Trump's impeachment team, where she was able to work as both a foreign lobbyist and a member of the U.S. government in private meetings with the President of the United States, which, isn't great. She was among the people behind the Hunter Biden laptop story in 2020 and also pushed lies that Trump had the election stolen from him in 2020. And now since then, she's been working for the America First Policy Institute, the think tank that is closely aligned with Donald Trump. So it's a lot. She is a Trump loyalist through and through. She has a pretty extensive legal background, which does make her, in a certain sense, a much more traditional choice for the Attorney General job, and doesn't come with the baggage of Matt Gaetz, so her nomination is likely going to go through. Now, all of that brings us to what somebody like Pam Bondi and what Donald Trump would do with a Department of Justice. So, like I've said before, the number one thing that Donald Trump wants his DOJ to do is go after political opponents. Now, that could be a number of people, including Joe Biden, Biden's family, Kamala Harris and her family, Nancy Pelosi and Congressman from California Adam Schiff, who he has repeatedly called the enemy within, the man that Trump is reportedly going to be naming as his pick for the FBI director, Kash Patel, has said that he wants to go after media companies and journalists in direct violation of the First Amendment. And most impactfully, Trump wants to nationalize or deputize local law enforcement to carry out his mass deportation plan, which would be a tough sell legally in the courts. And he would need an attorney general to fight for that, along with his 2 attorneys that represented him in his immunity case at the Supreme Court, which he's nominated to be his deputy attorney general and the United States Solicitor General. Now, Trump plans to deputize law enforcement by using a pair of laws from the 1800s, including an insurrection law that maybe sounds like he would be trying to call a large number of undocumented immigrants somehow an insurrection or an invasion of the United States. Like I said, it's going to be a tough fight legally on that, but that is at least how he wants to build this thing out. Trump has also said that he's going to be reinstating the Muslim ban, which was struck down in courts, or deporting pro-Palestinian protesters, which again would be against the First Amendment, and going after college and universities for, quote, woke agendas. Again, likely some freedom of speech things there. Trump is also mused about things like jailing or even shooting protesters, which in the event of something like a mass deportation, there would certainly be protests. In his first term, he also looked for ways to call for martial law, and he wants to be able to pardon January 6th rioters. Now, that is some of the flashy stuff there, admittedly, although obviously it is incredibly important. But then there are the plans to get rid of entire government departments or agencies like FEMA or NOAA or the Department of Education. Those plans would need legal backing. So would doing away with thousands of government jobs in positions all across the U.S. government, which is something that Trump will call frequently Schedule F. You don't need to know exactly what that is. It's just a classification for certain kinds of civil servants and public employees. And on top of that, he has talked about going further down the paths of changing the way our elections work and how the president interacts and puts pressure on Congress, which ultimately is in charge of what happens to the budgets for every single government agency. And all of that would fall on the shoulders of the new Attorney General and what she will decide to do. Now, that brings us today to our guest. Jonathan Bernstein is a political scientist who has written for outlets like the New York Times and Bloomberg, and you can find all of his great work right now on the Good Politics, Bad Politics podcast and Substack. We spoke yesterday after Matt Gaetz dropped out, but before Pam Bondi was named. So you'll know actually a little more than we knew at the time when we were talking, but I think it's still worth listening to because we go into what all of this means looking ahead to 2025 and just how big of a setback Matt Gaetz was for the Trump transition. What an eventful last hour and a half, 2 hours we've had here today. We are talking just 90-ish minutes after Matt Gaetz decided to withdraw himself. I know this will be sort of a hot take thing, but what do you think happened there?
Well, he didn't have the votes. It turned out that, putting somebody up who has a major scandal or multiple major scandals, there's actually some pushback to that. Now, apparently the reporting is that there were further shoes about to drop on it. And the big story here is that the whole cabinet selection process is really off the rails. That Trump and the transition group are not doing the normal vetting that you do for cabinet nominations and really for every level nominations. Now, the truth is that in the past, the vetting has been too intense. And people have been disqualified for things that are pretty minor and just going through it. But there's a difference between too much vetting and none at all. And, it seems that Trump was talked into this pick in one conversation while nobody else was in the room except for somebody advocating for Gaetz. And he said yes. And there was no, it's not clear that Trump made a calculated decision. Oh, well, I want this guy so much that it's worth it. Despite this major scandal that's ongoing that, the House Ethics Committee had a report ready on, he just sort of does it off the top of his head. And that's, of course, that was a huge problem for him through his first term in office. And it looks like things are going to be mostly the same in the second term of office.
That was my thinking, too, about the Gaetz pick. There are a lot of people who are talking about these sort of like 4D chess thing about choosing Matt Gaetz, knowing that Gaetz would never survive the nomination process, that you sort of, go a step too far and then bring it back to somebody who, in contrast to Matt Gaetz and the scandals that came with him, this next pick wouldn't seem so outlandish, even though they might actually be. I just don't think that's how Trump operates. And as a whole, that's not how he seems to be operating in terms of how he's choosing who's going to be in his cabinet. Is that the right way to think about this from where you sit?
That's exactly correct to me. There's something that I've talked about going back to when he was first elected that I call the clever fallacy. So the clever fallacy is the idea that we who talk about politics and write about it all the time and talk about it all the time, the one defining trait, it's not that we're necessarily smart, some are, some are not, but we're all clever. And we're all good at sort of gaming out, oh, the reason he did this is because of this, and that will happen. And the thing is that we do that to everybody. But with Trump in particular, it's really inappropriate because Trump does things spur of the moment without thinking them through. There's very little evidence that he actually does ever engage in strategic thinking. So, yeah, and we don't know how this goes. Maybe he winds up with an attorney general who's more extreme than he would have if he started with that person. But it's also possible, and in fact, I think likely, that this fiasco derails some of his momentum coming out of the election, especially with the media, and it may hurt his chances of getting some of these other people confirmed. And he's currently got a Secretary of Defense, a Secretary of Health and Human Services, and a intelligence community Director of Intelligence nominee, all of whom are in trouble at some, and we don't really know. The problem with all this is it happens behind the scenes, and we get reports and all that, but they all seem to be at least on some sort of shaky ground. And the fact that it turns out that you can take down a Trump nominee probably makes it easier to take down the next one.
Yeah, that was the next thing I was going to ask, too, because as we look at how Trump is setting up these nominations, it is clearly that he's just picking people that he either knows somewhat personally or sees them on Fox News. And that's sort of the basis for his thing. It's just loyalty. But he's also urged senators to head into recess. There's talk about him being able to suspend Congress and force them into a recess. Does this tamp down on some of those ideas that senators here sort of really flex their advising consent muscles a little bit?
Yeah, it's always been so. The deal with the recess appointments, I can go through sort of a brief version of what that is. The idea is that there is a constitutional power that presidents can temporarily put in appoint somebody who normally would have to be confirmed by the Senate. Normally, executive branch nominees, about 1,500 of them, something like that, but including the cabinet and cabinet level people, have to be confirmed by the Senate. But if they're out of town, you're allowed to put somebody on an interim basis, but the interim is actually a couple of years. So it's, given that a presidential term is only 4 years, it's a pretty big deal. Less so, there's a parallel thing with judges, but with judges, it's a lifetime appointment. So you wouldn't want to put somebody in who's going to be gone in a year. So the question had always been, well, what counts as Congress being out of town? The original provision was because, think back to the 18th century, and Congress was only in Washington briefly, and spent a lot of time out of town. And you couldn't, Secretary of State dies, and you need a Secretary of State, but even letting everybody know in Congress that there's been a death would have been, a multi-week process, right? You send the horses out.
The Pony Express is only so fast. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So, and then getting everybody back and coordinating getting everybody back. So it made sense back then. Obviously, that's not the case now. You can recall Congress anytime you want. And so there was a huge, big fight over years and culminating in the Obama administration of what counts as a recess. And the Supreme Court basically said, yeah, unless they're really out of town for quite some time, it's not. So that basically, and what Congress did as a result, and they've done this regardless of who the majority party is and regardless of who the president is, ever since this decision was made by the Supreme Court, they've made sure that there's nothing that counts as a recess, because the Supreme Court said, hey, all you have to do to avoid an elongated recess, even when you're gone in August for 5 weeks, as they do every year, all you have to do is come in, gavel it in, gavel it out, what's called a pro forma session. And it's not a recess. So essentially, the Supreme Court said, we're not going to have recess appointments anymore. Now, some of Trump's allies have looked at that and said, wait a second. There's this provision in the Constitution that says, well, if the two chambers disagree on what's a recess, then the president might be able to resolve it. And they've said, well, what we'll do is we'll have the House go on a recess and the Senate will say no. And then the president can say, okay, Congress is gone for the rest of the year.
Mm-hmm.
And for the purpose of recess appointments, you could be gone for, as soon as you get to the court approved 10 days, he could then drop all the recess appointments and, like I said, 1,500 or so people, and just appoint them all. So the question is, would the Senate and the House go for it? It seemed like a stretch. It's also probably not constitutional. It's probably not a fair reading of the Constitution, but we don't know what the Supreme Court would say if it came to an issue. And one of the rules about the Constitution is you don't get to ask them in advance. The court can only tell you what the Constitution means if there's an actual case over it. So, long explanation. But the real story is it doesn't look like the Senate, anyway, is going to just roll over for whatever Trump says. And it seems sort of likely that the House isn't going to either. Now, the other thing to say about all of these selections, Gaetz, RFK Jr., Tulsi Gabbard, and a couple others, is that these are people, like you said, who are Trump friends or people who were on TV. They are not, people have been comparing this to Justice Kavanaugh, who came up for a hearing and was accused of sexually assaulting someone when he was in high school. And Republicans basically dealt with that by saying, how dare you accuse this learned justice who likes beer of anything bad? We're all going to vote for him anyway. We don't care.
Right.
And way back in the 1990s, the same thing happened with current sitting Justice Thomas. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people said, well, Republicans just don't care about this stuff. The difference is that in the Supreme Court cases, these were people with serious constituencies within the Republican Party who really desperately wanted to have them confirmed. Tulsi Gabbard does not have a serious constituency in the Republican Party. She was a Democrat until a year ago. She's been on Fox News a bunch of times. But there are not people who are desperate. There are probably not people within the Republican Party who are desperate to have RFK Jr. At HHS. He's pretty dicey on their big issue of abortion. He's been pro-choice his whole life, and now he's going to fudge it. But and they're not, even Republicans who have turned anti-vax in the last couple of years, which is one of his big issues. That's not their big issue. That's not what organized groups in the Republican Party really care about. So you're not seeing the Republican constituency groups, organized groups, rally on behalf of these bizarre nominees.
Let's move on here in the last little bit to what a next Trump Department of Justice might look like here. The things that I've talked about in the past, and listeners will have just heard, are the things that I thought were the most important parts for Trump in choosing Matt Gaetz and whoever he chooses next will be a willingness of an attorney general and a DOJ to go after political opponents of Donald Trump. If it's, Kash Patel, he's talked about going after the media as well as political opponents. Do we think that we could see, I guess to use their own phrase, a weaponization of the Department of Justice that we really haven't seen since Herbert Hoover? Is that the kind of thing you think we're looking at?
This sort of gets into
I'm not Herbert Hoover. I'm sorry, Edgar Hoover. Edgar Hoover. Yeah, I'm sorry.
This gets into one of the huge questions about how this all plays out. Trump does not believe in the rule of law. And when I say that, it's not that he opposes it. He just doesn't think it exists. He doesn't sort of get that there's such a thing as the rule of law. He thinks that there's certain people who are criminals. Those are mainly chosen by ethnicity and skin color. And then he thinks for everybody else, it's sort of fair game to, he thinks that people have gone after him because it's personal. It has nothing to do with any laws that he may have broken. And he thinks that Republicans that he, in his first term, was nice to Barack Obama and Joe Biden and all these people by not indicting them. Now, that's not how the rule of law works at all, but I don't think he comprehends that. The question is, can he get his Justice Department to do it? And in a normal presidency, no. They haven't committed crimes. That sort of is a big stopping point. That's the old cliche has it that a grand jury will nominate a ham sandwich if a prosecutor puts on a show for them. But I don't know that that's true. Is somebody we've seen some of these lawyers who were involved in the insurrection and trying to overturn the 2020 election get stripped of their law licenses. We've seen Rudy Giuliani in the process of getting stripped of all his possessions. So some of these people might be enthusiastic enough that they will carry it out, but it's not just the attorney general. You need, line prosecutors to do these things, and they're going to be very resistant. And if you fire them, and perhaps they'll be successful in firing the top tier of the permanent civil service, you have to find somebody else who's willing to do these things, which are blatantly illegal. And there obviously are lawyers who are willing to do whatever it takes, but a lot of them are not. And then we have to see, there are judges who seem to do whatever Donald Trump wants, but there are a lot of judges out there, including Republican appointed judges, including Donald Trump appointed judges, who have stood up to his nonsense. And so there's a lot of steps that you have to go through to actually successfully start prosecutions of your political enemies just because you want to. Could it happen? Yeah. I mean, it's something to be very worried about. Is it a sure thing to happen? One of the things to really guard against, and a lot of people who are experts in authoritarianism are saying, do not consent in advance. And part of that is do not assume that Trump will get his way, or that some of these crazy characters who are surrounding him will get their way no matter what. And the one certain takeaway we can get from the Gaetz story is that no, Trump and these crazy characters do not always get their way. They can be defeated. The normal rules of politics still do at least sometimes apply. And that's pretty important to know going into the next 4 years.
Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
It's good fun. Thanks for having me.
Now it's time for TLTO, or Too Long, Too Doubt, where I tell you just the stuff you need to know from the stuff you just heard. Donald Trump's first pick to be his Attorney General, Matt Gaetz, withdrew his nomination after extremely damaging reporting about his alleged sex trafficking past and the fact that he couldn't get support from Republicans in the Senate. Trump then nominated former Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi, who has more or less been in lockstep with Trump and what he's wanted since 2016. Now, her past, going back before that, is filled with ethics scandals and controversies, not like Gaetz, but still an unusual amount of scandal for somebody who wants to be the country's top cop. When it comes to Trump's Department of Justice, he wants to use it in ways at best we haven't seen since the 1960s, and at worst, ways we've never seen. From making local police federal agents, to bringing on mass deportations, to retaliating against political enemies, altering the structures of government, and potentially how we choose our leaders. Okay, that is it for today's episode. I want to thank Jonathan again for coming on the show. If you want to see more of his work, you can go to Good Politics, Bad Politics. It is the Substack and podcast where he and another one of our former guests and friends of the pod, Julia Azari, have some of the best insights around about what is happening in politics right now. As for this podcast, as always, please rate and review the show on whatever podcast app you're listening to this on. If you haven't done that already, it really helps put the word out in the algorithm. It sort of games it a little bit for folks to find this who haven't listened to this yet. Like and subscribe and hit that bell for notification on YouTube so you don't miss out on any new episodes. Subscribe to the Make It Make Sense Substack, where I'll have the extended interview with Jonathan up tomorrow. And as always, continue to share the show on social media. I am at Grant Herms on X and now on Bluesky. You can find me there. I'm trying to sort of wean myself off of X a little bit. It's just becoming too hard to use. And I am at Grant Herms TV on everything else. And just a quick word, I'll be off next week for Thanksgiving, so there is no episode next week. Happy Thanksgiving in advance, and I will talk to you again in 2 weeks.